Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by my colleague and friend Joshua Blank. Josh, how are you today as the year winds down?
I feel pretty good. You know, I like the holiday season, right?
Yeah, well, good.
You know, why not?
Yeah, I think I'm still waiting for the onset a little bit more, but that may have more to do with our work schedule and haven't been under the weather last week than anything. But it's still, it's still not looking totally like the holidays to me, or feeling that way.
Well, no,
anyway.
and especially with this, this like stupid text. I was like, and this dang, slight like warm front that's come through here has really kind of messed with it.
Yeah, I think that's a
humidity
good
and
point.
sweating in the holidays don't really feel.
Yeah, when it's hot and clammy, it's not. So
anyway.
Well, it's only December 12th, but as we sit here at the UT Austin on campus, it always feels like the end of the year comes a little sooner here.
Oh yeah,
as things shut down. Parking very easy today.
Right.
The end of the year, though, is objectively close. This will be the last podcast of the year for us. So, I wanted to do something that helps us set the stage for next year, but also helps us in some ways to look back at what we've done. We've done a lot of polling this year.
Yeah, turns out.
And it's been as we've talked about in several circumstances, different contexts, it's been a fast and, somewhat frantic year in some ways. It certainly has felt that way to me, as we worked into some new workflows and election years.
They're election years.
They're kind of relentless, So, as we've talked about this, what we thought we'd do today for the podcast was sort of use a few key numbers that we've pulled out of mostly our data for mostly this year, although, we go back a little further for a couple things that kind of have, that we think have implications for politics in Texas in 2023. And that's, including what looms, the legislative session, which of course looms large in our lives and here in Austin and for people that follow Texas government and politics closely. So in a way that allows us to kind of take stock a little bit, but with an eye towards really what's coming up.
Right.
And, we've been going to events and talking to reporters and, I've done many panels and things like this in the last 6-8 weeks or so, including a couple of things last week. And it's very much in the air. Everybody's trying to balance that.
There's certainly a lot of, sometimes you walk into a session and it's clear like, oh, this is the thing. And then sometimes it's like you walk into a session, it's like, okay, everybody's competing over what the thing is.
Yeah.
And right now you hear a lot of different versions of kind of what the focus is going to be. And obviously, this is going to unfold, but like we're in that period right now.
Yeah. And I think that, we've had that version of that conversation. I think in some ways, I wonder, I don't know that we have so much less clarity this time, but I do think that the factors that are driving, I feel kind of certain about the factors that are driving the uncertainty. Let's put it that way, right?
Yeah.
In other words, I think that, the end of the election year, the results of the election, and the way, as we've talked on the podcast a lot, the election fits into the sequence of the last couple of elections, say the last 3 elections, they kind of clarify what some of the questions are, even if we don't, without knowing how it's going to shake out. And I'm sensing a lot of that out there.
Yeah, and I don't think that this is necessarily like, there's less clarity now than there normally is or anything like that. I think I said it this way, but I'll be even more specific. Like, I think sometimes there are sessions where it's very clear what is going to be at least one or a couple of the priorities. Like that is, you say that's set in stone. You can bet on that.
Yeah.
And then when in a session that doesn't have, those clear anchor points that everybody just knows are going to be a big piece of, attention, then you're kind of at this level of clarity, which is where we are now, which is kind of, trying to figure out who's going to get what and what there's going to be time for.
And and who's going to be, and who, who's going to be successful at driving what they want to drive, right? So let's dive into this. We've taken, like I said, 5 or so numbers, as points of departure. And one of them actually speaks to this, like, things that have seemed certain, things that and so we'll start with this number. We'll start with 60%. And 60% is the share of Republican voters who said that immigration and the border was the issue area most important to their vote in 2022. And in that same poll that I pulled that out of our most recent poll so far, October of 2022, 45% said the state spends too little on border security spending, 33% said about the right amount, and only 11% too much. And even though we didn't kind of lay it out that way, this is, I think, a perfect example of this kind of certainty-uncertainty balance.
Right.
So on one hand, we're like broken records about how consistent this kind of result is. But I think that how this is going to shake out this session, because of what's happened not only in the election, but in the last
2 years,
year and a half, 2 years, is really interesting. We added the spending number to the notes, and that's a good add, because on one hand, we know what Republican attitudes are on border security and immigration.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Governor Abbott ran pretty hard on this as a component of his campaign. Whether it was in all the ads, it was certainly part of his effort to secure the base running into and during the election. But we also know, as we've said in here a lot, they're spending an awful lot of money.
Well, right. And I mean, it was also certainly a feature of a lot of down ballot races. And part of the reason, again, we're broken record on this number, but it's important because it conditions, the political speak. But now, as we transition from the campaign, season in which, especially, a lot of, post redistricting, down ballot from the statewide level, you had a lot of Democrats running in very Democratic districts. You had a lot of Republicans running in very Republican districts. And if you want to talk to the most Republicans about an issue that they care about, immigration and border security remains that issue. But as you're, alluding to, and I'll just be more specific here, as spending and funding for border security has gone up over the last 2 years, in between the last time the legislature came and provided funding for DPS and border security operations, ultimately that seems like, that budget has increased from probably, around $1 billion to close to over $4 billion.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of
even that's just in.
Yeah, and look, and these are all approximate, but as a lot of people would point out, these numbers are necessary even just to kind of keep up the troop levels. I mean, there's just a lot of spending that goes into this. So, I think this one of the real questions that this issue raises is, if you've got this budget surplus of which so far under the spending cap there's about $12 billion or so to spend, unless you bust the spending cap, which is possible. That's a separate question. But let's say there's $12 billion.
Put a pin in that.
We'll put a pin in that. Yeah, write that down. But let's say there's about $12 billion as a starting point. You figure that, without COVID money to basically make the agencies whole, that a lot of the money was moved from to pay for Operation Lone Star and the, again, ongoing expenses for that. That's a big chunk.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so just as a starting point, I think that's something that we need to acknowledge here is that's like a big, I think, opening first question. I mean, that's sort of not even really high on the radar of like the policy things that people are talking about, but like how much and how long is the legislature going to continue sort of, or is going to make this operation whole really going forward? Because it's a big ticket item. Yeah,
and we were both at the legislative preview event that the Texas Tribune did last week on Friday, I guess, and Thursday. And I think on one hand, I didn't have legislators on that panel. I did moderated the panel of reporters. But I've yet to, have anybody suggest, when I've asked somewhat rhetorically, if there are concerns about spending more than $4 billion on border security, who is the first Republican in the legislature that's going to raise their hand and say that in a definite way in open court? And I don't see a lot of takers.
Exactly. But it's interesting because this is one of those ways where I think that the very clear political constraints around immigration and the border are going to create some real like fundamental mechanical constraints in terms of on the budget almost immediately if basically the goal is going to be, okay, we're going to continue this at current spending levels, if not higher. Well, okay, that's a lot of the surplus. Whether it's $12 billion, whether it's $24 billion. Yeah,
right. Well, I think a little over $2 billion has been added in the interim. I think by the time you added everything up in the regular session, it was around $2 billion, and now it's north of $4 billion.
Right.
So that still is, yeah, as you say, a pretty big chunk. And I would add to that, I moderated another panel on Wednesday that involved state legislators. And most interestingly, this was a panel that was focused on higher education. And towards the end of the panel, as the legislators talked about, it was for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Largely good discussion, fairly positive. Probably a lot of people in the room heard things they wanted to hear about, the enthusiasm for things like workforce development and affordability and et cetera. But I tried to press them a little bit, and I should say, in particular, Appropriations Chair, Expected Appropriations Chair, again, Representative Greg Bonin, about where higher ed would be in the queue.
Yeah.
And, there was a moment there. I mean, it was interesting. There was a moment as we were talking about these priorities where the Democrat on the panel, Senator Jose Menendez, said, look, I think we all just have to say that the elephant in the room is that property taxes is the number one thing right now on the agenda for the leadership that everybody is going to try to do something about. And that's going to have to be taken care of first, essentially. That's putting words in his mouth a little bit, but that was the point.
Yeah.
Well, Chairman Bonin then kind of made it a point to circle back and say, look, I just want to be clear. I think we can do property tax relief and higher ed. It's not an either or. We can do something on both of those fronts.
Sure.
Now, what that made me think was that how many different conferences, if I was to do a public ed conference the next day, or I'd moderated a panel on border security the day after that, I think there are a lot of people saying, well, we can do more than one thing. But as we've said in here before, this is a little like, the psychology of, getting a windfall, right? You could spend it a lot of times in your head, and there's a lot of heads in the legislature doing that. So it's a very interesting political question about here that I don't think there's a clear answer to this at this point.
And I think what you're talking about here about, sort of how much real estate there is on the agenda is something that, I think we're going to come back to a couple of times going through these points, and sort of where there are some challenges here is going to have to do with, again, the limited attention, time, space, all the things everybody knows about who probably listens to this podcast. But the fact that all those features that already make legislating, during the 140-day session difficult, it's not like the addition of the money makes it easier.
Right. Which leads us to the next number. Right. So the next number I have on here is 52%. 52% is the share of Republicans. And again, we've got a couple of Republican numbers here because we're talking about politics and the governing coalition largely. 52% was the share of Republicans who said in our April 2022 poll that population growth is bad for the state. This really, I think, brings this issue, this notion of what the carrying capacity is of the money on hand is. Because there's a really interesting kind of emerging discussion in legislative circles, particularly, in this kind of, well, it depends on your audience maybe. Mm-hmm. But I keep hearing people talking about infrastructure. We heard about it on Thursday.
Yeah.
We're hearing about it from, non-trivial actors in the process who are talking about transportation, who are talking about water, who are talking about, social infrastructure. Right. And that was that's the theme of some of the education discussions. And we're going to hit education in a minute. But it's not the kind of thing that's getting a lot of public airing. But the reason I chose this number is that there are a lot of reasons, obviously, that people might think that population growth is bad for Texas.
Sure.
And we've talked about that in here, given demographics, given cultural politics. But we've done a lot of polling both here and in some of our other work that suggests that it's not just that. People feel like the state in many policy areas is not managing its growth very well. Healthcare would be another one. Rural areas. And so I think that I picked this number because I really do wonder if there's a through line here in these infrastructure discussions. And as we've talked about in here before, we were just talking about a few minutes ago before we started recording, these big infrastructure packages wind up taking more than one session. There's just no two ways about that. People talked about water for If you go back to the very beginning, kind of close close to a decade before we got the big water infrastructure funding design and all that infrastructure that was passed in 2013, which I would also add relevant to this is those entities are on sunset review this time.
Right.
So, I think that is out there. I mean, and it's a really open question about whether, to the extent that we as we think about this, about who is willing to spend time and political capital on this at a point, I believe infrastructure. The Lieutenant Governor even mentioned infrastructure, I think, in his agenda setting press conference a couple of weeks ago. I think this is out there, and I just wonder how much of it is going to coalesce or whether it's going to get kind of lost in the shuffle, because there are going to be opportunities to talk about this pursuant to the sunset discussion, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. I mean, I think you've covered most of what I think is interesting about this. I mean, I'll just say, this is one of those interesting things that I think hits at a very interesting, complicated intersection, right? I mean, Texas and Texas's elected officials really take it as a point of pride they return to over and over again, the state's business friendliness, right? And being friendly to business isn't simply about low regulations or low taxes. It's also about having the infrastructure that allows businesses to operate. And that means roads, that means houses that their workers can live in.
It takes a lot of water to make chips.
Reliable internet, a lot of water to make chips, a lot of electricity, right?
Yeah.
Takes a lot of electricity to run Bitcoin farms, right?
Right.
I mean, ultimately, and we've cataloged sort of continuing negative evaluations about the trajectory of the state. We've done various, polling that shows a certain amount of dissatisfaction with a lot of the basic services. So, I mean, there's clearly a need here. And going back to where we started, there's a big budget surplus. And I'm thinking if I'm a big trade group, it's not like I'm necessarily looking for like another tax cut, although I wouldn't mind it. I mean, there's certainly discussions about that going on. But really, I mean, in a lot of cases, what you need road and you need fiber.
Yeah.
In a lot of places. At the same time, it's really bad politics, right? Infrastructure projects take forever. I love this
Right.
example. I return to this because it's a good one, which is, any major transportation project is about a 10-year project. So for a politician who's going to have 5 elections in that time period, essentially all you're delivering to people is more bad traffic before they actually get the solution in the case
Right.
of, let's say, for example, something like that. And then I think this number that you raised, the 52% who say the population growth is bad. Again, there's a lot of dimensionality to what people are reacting to when they're reacting to population growth. But I think, living in Austin, I think you feel this a lot, but it's not totally clear what the I'm putting this in quotes, like what the correct ideological
Right.
response is to growth and the policy response to it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that creates a lot of, I think, not only they're not landmines because they're known, it's landmines because it's unknown. I mean, ultimately, when you get into this sort of development stuff and infrastructure stuff, you can have a lot of very progressive Democrats who don't look very progressive anymore. And you can have a lot of business friendly Republicans who may not understand the importance of these infrastructure projects to kind of long term, business, vitality in an area. And so this is just one of those areas that's like, ooh,
Right.
And to your point, I mean, in the past, when it has been something like water or the transportation, the point was to build up momentum. And I remember, when we were doing some polling around the water stuff, I remember we polled on that amendment,
Yeah.
which we didn't really want to do, but we did it anyway, it was a long time ago. But ultimately, what you find is by that point in time, most people had understood and were kind of made aware of the fact that like this is important, key infrastructure. We have to do this.
Right.
But that took time, right? This isn't on people's.
Well, and that's that's very late in the process, right?
Yeah.
And what was painstaking about that was how much of work has to be done in ways that are not. I don't want to say out of the public view, because as soon as you say out of the public view, and that's not really what I meant. It's just. But in parts of the process that are not salient to the public and that are not watched, there's a lot of coalition building. But the public, I use the number of Republicans, but if you look at the overall responses to that, only a third of respondents in that poll said that population growth was good for the state. Yeah. And the difference along party lines was, most noticeable in the sense that the people that didn't have an opinion, there was a lot more, sort of lack of commitment or attention among Democrats and independents than among Republicans.
Yeah, which again I think speaks to this overall issue, which is I think it's
people might be seeing that different things are being read into the question at that point, possibly. But,
I think that's right. But I also think part of this is that again, this is the nature of the question, all that kind of stuff. But I think for a lot of people this is mixed. I mean, ultimately, right? And I think that's that's what's sort of so tricky here. But, ultimately it does have like a very kind of clear potential constraint when it comes to, well, how much money are we going to spend on infrastructure, right? When you look at this and you say, well, who's clamoring for infrastructure? Well, we say, well, nobody right now per se, except for the fact that all of this infrastructure costs, the other piece of this has gotten much more expensive than it was a year ago.
Yeah, that came up in one of those panels at the something we saw.
Yeah, I think
we were both there. I
preview,
think it was with one of the Tribune panels that people were talking about the increased costs. But, I think the other piece of this is, this is a little bit by way of transition. One of the things that's interesting to me about this is, trying to parse out where I wrote down when you used the word, because I've been using it a lot in trying to, and I'm still not sure it's quite right, but where the energy is in terms of what we used to think about as the very powerful kind of developmentalist coalition in the state.
Yeah.
And this goes, back a long time to previous periods of rapid development in the state's history that involves, when the Democrats were running the show, it's thought of as kind of centrist. From some perspective, it's sort of pro-business. Mm-hmm. But how that impulse, let's call it,
right?
Where that lives right now and how powerful it is, the ability of people that see governing and see, this kind of developmental impulse is part of the governing responsibility of the legislature. It's hard to get a read on where that is right now, to me, vis-a-vis all the other powerful things. That's why I really enjoy, you raising like that work we did almost a decade ago now, I guess, in terms of the constitutional amendment and the run-up to all that, really underlines the importance of being able to carve something like that out in the agenda, sustain a multi-year effort to get it in front of people and to actually get these big structural, institutional, for lack of a better term, subsystems put in place. It's just so noisy around that right now.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, look, we're smart guys. That stuff is really complicated.
Yeah.
The whole financing mechanism set up for water back then was pretty complicated. And when you're talking, I was just thinking to myself, and we can move on from infrastructure to something a lot more salient to people here in a second. But I also wonder to what extent, because of the winter storms, because of continued, I think concern over the possibility of any sort of, stoppage in the generation of the state's electrical power.
Right.
Ultimately, I wonder, that's going to take up a lot of mental energy and resources around the infrastructure question that kind of makes some of this other stuff like, well, are we also going to do transportation?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine. And, I think this is something else that's kind of, because of the complexity you're talking about, and I had written this thing because you mentioned the grid and passing as part of the infrastructure. That is not settled.
No.
There's a big fight going on about that, right? There are several big fights going on around that right now that have to do with, as fundamental a question that's been moving that there's not agreement in the state's key leaders about who's actually going to do this.
Right.
Because, a plan has been put forth which has received significant pushback, particularly in the Senate. Mm-hmm. And Lieutenant Governor Patrick has staked out a very interesting position on this that is very different that is, I think, in important ways different than the position the governor has taken, and in some ways very subtly antagonistic. And we're going to come back to that. And so that, I think you're right, that has to be settled, I think. And I don't know how you settle the other stuff before you settle that, or at least divert people's attention. Although, again, there will be a lot of different centers of power on this. Now, we talked about this developmental politics. The next number points to maybe the alternative vision of where the agenda should be. So, the next number I would start with as a departure point is 50%. And that's from our August 2022 poll. And 50% is the share of Republicans who said that they disagree that same-sex marriage should be legal in Texas.
Right.
So in a time when there's been a lot of discussion of, about how the social policy and the cultural politics of the legislature in the last couple of sessions has been, particularly last session, has been out of step with identifiable majorities in Texas public opinion, it's important to keep in mind that the cultural currents in the Republican Party are still feeding a very powerful counter-reaction to what I think a lot of people, particularly, Democrats, I suppose, but, a non-trivial share of Republicans, had thought of as a much broader social and institutional acceptance of the secular expansion of rights, not just to gay people and LGBTQ constituencies, if I can call them that, but for that matter to women. I mean, I led with gay marriage because the number is so striking, and I made a lot of it kind of at the time when we were doing media on this because we hadn't asked about gay marriage in a while. And it was a reminder. It's like, still a pretty big chunk of people that are very resistant out there. But the politics around LGBTQ issues and abortion in the last 2 years in Texas have underlined, the dynamic that this is not settled in very stark terms. Obviously, Dobbs underlined that at the national level and underlined, just how many differences there are regionally and in the different states. But I think, it's one of the critical dynamics that I think is another open question that we're going to see play out in this session. I mean, I think, there are issues that many urban and secular people thought were settled and in a sense subject only to a kind of, rear guard, action that are pretty obviously not settled for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that, there's been a certain confusing of, I would say, I'd say progress in the, I don't know, I think that's what I mean. Progress in the popular culture with respect towards depictions of various different minority groups, and not just racial and ethnic, but obviously also, in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. And there's been a confusion of, I think, the prevalence of those images for consensus.
Yeah.
And I think the point is, and you could have picked, I mean, we kind of had a little back and forth. I mean, we could have picked a bunch of different numbers for this to illustrate this point. We're just picking one here to kind of, again, make this point. Even though, we look at the last legislative session, we had noted, it's, how conservative it was. I think many members, and again, in these legislative previews, are still, I think taking credit for it being the most conservative session. So I think, it's fair to call it that. And we pointed out throughout the 2021 year and in 2022, where, I think policy was deviating from kind of the central tendency of public opinion in Texas. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that it is that policy has deviated significantly from the central tendency in Republican opinion in Texas. And so when we're talking about a lot of these cultural issues that it feels like, the legislature went so far on last time, there's not really anything underlying like let's say the voting populace that would lead anyone to say, oh, well, is this going to change? And I think the best example I have is, is in terms of what to my mind would be about, abortion policy. We could have picked an abortion number for this. But, a lot of reporters have asked me, well, now that the legislature has gone so far in basically banning abortion on almost all circumstances in a state that obviously, the majority of the public is not for this, do you expect them to kind of move back in the other direction? In my
Isn't the thermostat going to kick in?
Isn't the thermostat going to kick in? I said, and one of the things I've just been saying to people, and it's true, and I sort of realized this myself, is, yeah, but all that data was there. So, I mean, when we talk about where abortion attitudes are in 2021 and 2022, that's pretty much where abortion attitudes were in 2019 and 2016, really even in 2013, 2014. Yeah. And the laws were passed, right? The 6-week, ban was passed. The trigger law was passed. The vigilante, law was passed. The enforcement mechanism. All this was passed under that structure and that set of public attitudes. And they all still exist. So this is just to say, if anybody is necessarily thinking like, oh, well, the thermostat's going to kick back on and we're going to move back to something a little more moderate, I actually think, this is a good example of, I don't think so. I mean, ultimately, there's still a lot of appetite among Republicans for, I would say, conservative policies and, returning to conservative social structures and norms. We see that all throughout the data. We could have picked, again, a bunch of different numbers that would point to this. But there's a lot of appetite for, quote unquote, traditional social structures among Republican voters.
And Republicans are institutionally positioned to deliver that. And a lot of legislators feel institutional incentives in that direction, right? Given something we talked about in here a lot, of course, the the systematic weakness of the Democratic Party, the primaries as a filtering system for this, et cetera.
Now, in terms of the uncertainty going into the session, I think the one question becomes like, I mean, we could start making a list of all the potential things that could kind of fall into this category of sort of, whatever we want to call it, socially polarizing policy.
Well, you can look at a lot of early bill filings by the usual suspects for this.
And I think, traditionally what we tend to think about this kind of stuff is like, again, a similar thing. There's only so much room on the agenda, and also this kind of stuff takes a lot of time and makes a lot of hurt feelings along the way. So in terms of, we've talked before about how they pace out, another abortion bill when it comes out in the session kind of matters, right? But if you have, more abortion restrictions, attempts to, limit the rights of LGBTQ people, more forays into public schools, which we'll get to in a second.
Yeah.
Ultimately, like that's a lot of floor fighting. Right, that's a lot of parliamentary inquiries. That's a lot of time and space, and generally, further I think negative impacts on whatever collegiality exists.
Right, and
so how does that get balanced out? Given again an electorate that seems to still be pretty, again a Republican electorate still seems to be pretty, still seems to have a pretty good appetite for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have to kind of, we're seeing an early, kind of taking of the temperature on this in terms of the fight over, that it's not even the fight. I should say this, the nominal challenge to the speaker, to Speaker Phelan by forces that are coalescing around Representative Tinderholt and his declared candidacy about Democratic chairs. And, that's kind of a heat check on this, as you raise collegiality and the desire to work, to cooperate on issues and on some of these things. I think how that gets handled is going to be very interesting. Well, and what I mean by that, just to be direct, is not, Tony Tinderholt is not going to be speaker, and I'll be shocked if Dade Phelan is not speaker again. But how much ground is given there?
Yeah.
I think an early indicator, and it will not come as early as everybody wants probably, because it never does, is when we see who the House committee chairs are, how many chairs Democrats do get. I think I said on here a few weeks ago, the obvious compromise here is to say, I hear you, and to say, there'll be fewer Democratic chairs, but that's politically sensitive for the speaker. Although I will be surprised if we don't see some decrease in the number of Democratic chairs from the previous session. What will that decrease be, and where will those committee chairs be?
Yeah, and ultimately, what this is about is, again, the Democratic committee chair is a part of this, but what this is also about is the fact that, in general, the House the House in Texas doesn't necessarily want to have a floor vote and a floor fight on every single piece of culture war policy that could come to their desks. And part of the issue about Democratic chairs, at least as I understand it, is the notion that is out there, which I think is, both a notion among some voters, and I think it's fanned on by, some representatives and their allies to say, well, look, we have a Republican legislature, we have Republican statewide, we should be able to do whatever we want. But the issue is this assumes that there's really agreement even among Republicans that whatever we want is actually...
Well, because one of the most active transmitters of that message is basically the other, the Senate.
Right.
And the lieutenant, led by the lieutenant governor. And this came up at the Tribune thing too, and I think it was a good thing to kind of be handled again, is that given what we saw, given the results of the 2022 election, I think I have every expectation that we are going to see one of the things that we've seen from the Senate in previous sessions. It wasn't so prominent last time, which is, although it was there to some degree, which is the Senate sending over bills by the cartload.
Yep.
And the House having to figure out what they're going to do, in particular the speaker and the leadership team.
Right.
All right, so before we run out of time, so let's go to another number, 20%. 20%, and this is from October of 2021 and goes back to the end of, remember this was kind of the after session poll because there were 3 special sessions last time. But, at that point, only 20% approved of how state leaders in the Texas legislature had handled property taxes. And, we mentioned I mentioned property taxes anecdotally, but this goes to a point that you were making this morning, which I think is, I think you're right, because it's so complicated. It comes up in some discussions. I think we both agree not enough, but it is complicated. And that is when we're talking about this powerful impetus for property taxes reduction, that inevitably is going to cost money because of the interrelationship and the dependency between property taxes and school funding.
Right. I mean, basically, it's one of these things, and it's sort of so interesting to me that, like, this isn't, I mean, I don't know. It's not interesting. It's like one of the things that I feel like I've drawn
It's
out of.
interesting when you're in a certain mood.
Well,
Yeah.
well, no, I mean, it's one of those things like, you could obviously fill many books with the things that, people don't understand about things they don't care about, right?
Yeah.
But to me, this is one of those sort of fundamental relationships that I think gets oversimplified or just ignored perpetually, both from the political standpoint, but even once we get into the policy space here, which is, you can't mess around with property taxes without messing around with public school financing.
Right.
And that is not a little dial to be turning. That's a big dial with a lot of impact. And so part of it is, there's all these questions to my mind about, the idea of using, again, a surplus for something that ultimately is going to be an ongoing expense, but also, they'd have to make the public schools whole. And this kind of goes back to the agenda question again, which is, okay, well, what's on the agenda for public education? And I say, well, okay, obviously the Senate would like to do school vouchers, right? There's also a lot of talk about curriculum, right? There's a lot of talk about LGBTQ students and, their rights. There's talk about libraries. There's also, potentially a real shortage in teachers.
Right.
There's school safety. Okay.
And I would also add that in the very, in one of the, kind of more old fashioned now, concerns in public education, we're seeing a lot of data about a real decrease in student achievement in the aftermath of the pandemic.
Right. Absolutely.
Which is a
serious problem.
It might even be a core problem.
Yeah. No, it's going to be, it's one of those things, if you're an economist, you say, what's the most expensive problem of all these things? That's the most expensive problem. Right. I mean, a bunch of third graders who can't read and fourth graders and fifth graders who can't read is a very, very expensive problem.
Right. And it's a problem that ripples through.
Yeah, no, I mean, when I say expensive, I mean, like thinking about when these kids turn 25. I mean, that's how expensive we're talking about these kinds of problems. And so, the sort of, the one thing that seems to be what everybody agrees on, which is, well, we're going to deal with property taxes. And everybody's kind of saying, yeah, look, we've got to figure out a way to do something on this. We've got the surplus to do. It's like, yeah, but what happens to all of the, the other things that come up because you deal with property taxes? And that's something that I'm kind of like, again, going back to, what we've talked about, generally when you deal with the public school finance system, it's like a big deal. Like last time they did that, there was a whole lot of interim hearings, a big interim report, very good read, I recall. I've got, really explained some of this stuff and what they were going to do and what the constraints are. That's not really how we're talking about this.
And what they did was substantial, but not, it wasn't a fundamental redesign of the architecture or anything like that. And I remember.
It was an adjustment of the formulas. I
mean,
ultimately what happened was the formulas had gotten out of whack. The gist of this, everybody who listens to this should know, but if you haven't, just do this real quick because it's worth it, right? Basically, what happened is that, essentially property taxes fund, local schools, but then to the extent they go over a certain amount of money for that area, they go to the state, and the state then makes up some of the additional money, and there's formulas that then basically divvy up that money to the school districts based on the number of students and the type of students.
Right.
Okay. The issue was over time, essentially, as property values have gone up and up and up and up, the share of money that's coming in via property values kept going up, and the legislature realized, we could spend less on our side because we'll still be spending the same amount of money. Yeah. But then what's happened is the balance over time between who's paying for the majority of public school funding had shifted to the taxpayer, to the homeowners, we would say, or to property owners. So the legislature came back. They said, we need to adjust that formula. And ultimately what they did in that last session, again, I'm oversimplifying this and feel free to, I'm being very clear. This is very oversimplified, but adjust the formula so that the state could then become the majority provider of the funds for public education while trying to give teachers a raise and accomplish some other things and obviously reduce property taxes.
Ultimately re-injected some funds that had actually been removed.
Right. But the difficulty is the fundamental problem that underlies this has not changed, which is that what did this and what created the situation is that, if property values keep going up, well, then property taxes or property tax revenues are necessarily going to increase. We can try to constrain them, which the legislature has done. From the top, from the bottom, there are different ways they can try to constrain it, and they've done all of these things. But ultimately, the market is what the market is for houses, and it creates this issue. But having said that, you can't just go in there and say, well, what if we just give everybody what if we just increase everybody's, homestead exemption? It's like, well, okay, you've got a big hole in your public education budget that needs to be refilled, which is actually what you're refilling. That's actually where the money gets spent. But the issue becomes, a couple of things. One is the political one, which is most people are not going to notice this property,
which we've found time and time again. Seemingly large percent increases in the homestead exemption generate very low return per taxpayer.
Per taxpayer, right? And so, but the hole
In this context, per voter.
But the hole that you've created on the budget side
Right.
is still there.
And, this is coming at a time when, for the reasons I was talking about before, one of the data points that we can add to this, only 6%, and this is a pretty steady, say that
Right.
K through 12 public education in quality in Texas is excellent.
Right.
That was as recent as October. You couple that with, the lost ground that we're experiencing in a state education system that was functioning at best mediocre in terms of achievement and score anyway.
Sure.
It's kind of to me, at least from a policy perspective, it's a difficult position to stand up and say, yeah, we can give you a property tax cut,
Yeah.
broadly speaking, but make the public education system whole again. Because the obvious response to that is, hey, look, making it whole in the status quo,
Yeah, not really.
kind of not really doing much here, given all those things like teacher raises and
Well, I think,
all the other things that could be done, remediating lost, finding out figuring out ways of, what we're going to do to capture lost ground.
But I think the contrast exactly between like this sort of, walking into kind of this idea that we're going to do a property tax reduction on the one hand, whereas when they actually did work on the school finance system and property tax session and the property taxes in that session, like that was a very concerted effort where I think everybody knew like, okay, we're doing these two things together and they have to happen together. And so there was a tandem conversation going on about these things. Whereas like right now, I don't see where the conversation, like I'll say this, in no preview that I've gone to or article that I've read, have I seen any indication of how the public school system would be made whole in the face of a property tax cut. And that's
let alone
made better or improved
Yeah.
or fixed or dealt with these major issues. And like, that's a big, big, big open question.
Right. Particularly given that I think, the politics of this are such that if you settle a deal on that, there is no way that the Senate, and particularly the lieutenant governor, is not going to hold any kind of deal hostage without some money for vouchers.
Which could kill the whole thing.
Whether it's a,
Yeah,
pilot
absolutely.
program or whatever. So, I think if there's one place you start looking for where, we might wind up watching the legislature have to come back in June, it would be there. So, all right. So, we've gone on for a while. Fine. We're going to start with one last, we're going to tie this together.
We're going to end.
What was that?
You said start. I'm saying we're going to end.
Well, we're going to start to tie this together.
Okay,
right?
got it.
We're going to start to tie this together with one last number that is not a poll number, but I think is critical here and points to some poll numbers. And that is 12.5%. 12.5% is not a poll number, but it is the average Republican margin of victory in the 6 top statewide races in the 2022 election. In other words, the non-judicial races. As we know, Governor Abbott wins by 11%, and the others are, sort of around that. And it really does point to this macro level question that we're kind of elaborating here that kind of helps us end here, which is, where does the agenda fall if we'll take the 2 most recent sessions as like the model for, say, endpoints, right? 2019, as you were saying, being a very pragmatic session, bandwidth like taken up by this, largely by this education property tax, sort of discussion that went on. 2021 being, as everybody is quick to trumpet, the most conservative legislative session in the history of legislative sessions or
Ever,
something.
anywhere.
I guess you have to go back to post-Reconstruction maybe, but, it depends what you mean by conservative, I guess. And then you've got this debate with another layer of context there being, Governor Abbott's job approval among Republicans right now after winning the election, about 80%.
Right.
Lieutenant Governor Patrick, about 70%, but proportional, pretty close to the governor if you adjust for the degree to which, many fewer people know who the lieutenant governor is than know who the governor is. And I think right now that there's just not a lot of clarity. We're already seeing, and we were talking about this before the podcast started. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now that really points to all this uncertainty is, you look at, and again, we're reading for some degree of tea leaves here for sure. But if you think about it as signaling, the agenda that the governor kind of implied in the night he was elected, Then you have the agenda laid out by Lieutenant Governor Patrick last week before last. And we're seeing the table set with the terms of what the trade-offs are going to be here. And I think we've covered a lot of them in this. We've done it.
Yes.
I'll pat ourselves
Not a
on the back.
surprise. A little more than I think we intended.
We got a lot of things on the table here.
Yeah.
But that kind of gives you the sense of where the universe of trading is going to be. But I think, the other thing that is interesting here is that we really are at a very kind of threshold moment policy-wise for the state. And that's why I wanted to emphasize, the business pieces, the development, this notion of, if you take 2019 and you take 2021, what we're really looking at, I think, is like, what is the mix between fan service to the Republican base and a broader vision of governance of the state? And as we circulate around in capital circles and start talking to people and begin to look at what the trade groups and the professional associations and the industrial associations are doing, there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And I think there are a lot of questions about how much responsibility the legislature is going to take on right now for some of the big policy questions about what is going on in the political economy of the state and in the economy of the state. And I don't see a lot of clear signals about how that's going to shake out yet.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. Yeah.
So I think this has been a good way of doing that.
Yeah.
We've gone on for a while. I'm going to thank you for all the time you put into this and all the stuff you've done all this year, since it's a year-end podcast.
Oh, thank you.
We've got a lot. We've covered a lot of ground this year. We got a lot done. It's felt like a slog a lot of the time. I think we both. But one of the funny things about doing this is this was a good exercise preparing for this and looking back and kind of going, there's a lot of shit this year.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Pretty interesting stuff.
And there's a lot of stuff out there. That said, so what I'm going to say is you've made it this far. Heads up, spoiler alert. Keep an eye out for a final poll of the year that we're going to do, and that's going to drop at the end of the week. We're not even exactly sure when. There's a lot on the table right now, but certainly by the end of the week, we'll have another poll that's somewhere between a taking stock. It's not really a pre-session poll per se in a very direct way, but it does look at some of the issues that we're talking about here in a way that we haven't looked at least in a while on some of these things, and some of these is some first effort stuff. So keep an eye out for that, because I think, if you're one of the people that listens to this and you've made it this far in this podcast,
there's gonna be some interesting
you'll
stuff for
probably
you.
be interested in it. So with that, thanks again to Josh, and thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin. We'll probably post this podcast, since the nature of this was so numerical. We'll put together a blog post with some of the data that we mentioned in here. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next year with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.